Security tried to expel a black couple from the front row of Dean Martin's show one night in 1955. And what Dean Martin did in that moment would echo through the decades, becoming one of the most important moments in entertainment history. A moment when a man chose his conscience over his career, chose what was right over what was safe, chose to use his immense power and privilege to stand up for people who had none. To understand the weight of this moment, to understand why what happened that night mattered so profoundly, you have to understand the world that Dean Martin was living in. You have to understand the landscape of America in 1955, a country still shackled by the chains of segregation, a country where laws were deliberately designed to keep black people separate and inferior, a country where a black person could be imprisoned for sitting in the wrong section of a restaurant, for trying to drink from the wrong fountain, for daring to believe that they deserved to be treated with the same dignity and respect as a white person. The poison of segregation had infected every part of American society. It was in the schools and the hospitals and the courthouses. It was in the buses and the trains and the airports. It was in the laws that governed the country and in the hearts of the people who enforced those laws. But perhaps nowhere was the contradiction more stark, more obvious, more deeply wrong than it was in the entertainment industry. The entertainment industry was supposed to be the place where people went to escape the harsh realities of the world. It was supposed to be the place where art and music and laughter and beauty transcended the divisions that separated people. It was supposed to be a refuge, a sanctuary, a place where for a few hours you could forget about race and class and all the petty divisions that kept humanity divided. But the entertainment industry was not immune to this poison. In fact, it was one of the worst offenders. It was perhaps the most hypocritical place in America. Nightclubs across the country, from the Catskills to Miami Beach to Las Vegas to Los Angeles, had strict policies about who could and could not sit where. In the South, black entertainers could perform for white audiences, but they had to use separate entrances. They had to eat in separate kitchens. They had to use separate bathrooms. They had to dress in separate dressing rooms. They were good enough to make white people laugh and cry and feel something deep in their souls, but they were not good enough to sit in the same room as them when the performance was over. They were good enough to entertain, but not good enough to be treated as human beings. The system was a contradiction so obvious, so absurd, so deeply wrong that it should have been impossible to maintain. But it was maintained day after day, night after night, through violence and intimidation and the simple acceptance that this was just the way things were. Frank Sinatra had been one of the first major entertainers to challenge this system. He had refused to perform at segregated venues. He had insisted on equal treatment for all performers. But even Sinatra's actions had been limited in their scope and their impact. The system was too big, too entrenched, too supported by law and custom, to be defeated by the actions of one man, no matter how famous he was. The South had its Jim Crow laws that explicitly mandated segregation. But the North had its own kind of segregation, just as vicious but more subtle, just as effective but more deniable. In the North, segregation was enforced through custom rather than law, through the polite refusal of service rather than the explicit ban, through the suggestion that this is just how things are rather than the declaration that this is how things must be. Dean Martin was not particularly known as an activist or a social crusader when he was at the height of his fame. He was an entertainer, pure and simple. He was a man who loved to sing and to make people laugh. He was a man who had pulled himself up from poverty and made himself into a star through talent and charisma and an almost supernatural ability to connect with audiences. He was a man who had the perfect voice, smooth and warm and inviting, the kind of voice that made you want to listen to him sing forever. He had the perfect face, handsome in a way that seemed effortless, that seemed natural, that made people want to look at him. He had the perfect timing, an instinctive sense of when to pause, when to speed up, when to let a moment breathe. He had charm that could melt stone, an easygoing manner that made people feel comfortable around him, that made people feel like they were the only person in the world who mattered. He had a gift for making people feel good, for creating moments of escape and beauty in their ordinary lives, for giving people a few hours where they could forget about their troubles and just enjoy the music and the laughter. He had built his career on making people feel good. He had built his career on entertainment, on performance, on the simple act of getting up on a stage and making people happy. He was not a man who was known for taking stands on political issues. He was not a man who had made his name by fighting for justice. He was not a man who had written about civil rights or marched in protests or given speeches about equality. He was a man who wanted to sing and to perform and to be loved. He was a man who had learned to navigate the world carefully, to avoid conflict, to get along with everyone. He was a man who understood that the entertainment industry was controlled by powerful people, many of whom had connections to organized crime, all of whom had the power to make or break a career with a single word. He was a man who had learned to survive in that world by being careful, by being smart, by not making waves. But Dean Martin was also a man who had come from nothing. He was a man whose parents had been immigrants, Italian immigrants, who had come to America with nothing and had struggled to build a life in a country that did not want them. He was a man whose parents had faced discrimination, who had been mocked for their accent, who had been treated as less than human because of where they came from. He was a man whose family had been poor, desperately poor. The kind of poor where you didn't know if you were going to have enough to eat. The kind of poor where the walls of your house were thin and the winters were brutally cold. He was a man who had been mocked in school for his accent, for his clothes, for the fact that his family didn't have money. He was a man who understood what it felt like to be on the outside, to be less than, to be treated as though you didn't matter, as though your life was worth less than the lives of the people around you. He was a man who had clawed his way up from those depths through sheer force of will and talent, who had not forgotten where he came from, who carried within him a memory of hunger and cold and the feeling of being unwanted. And somewhere deep inside him, in a place that maybe even he didn't fully understand, he carried a sense of justice. He carried a sense that all people deserved to be treated with dignity. He carried a sense that what was happening in America, what was happening in his own industry, was wrong. It was a belief that he didn't talk about much, that he didn't make a big deal about, but it was there. It was there in the way he treated people who worked for him. It was there in the small kindnesses he extended to people who had nothing. It was there in his refusal to accept the idea that some people were simply worth less than others. The Sands Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas was one of the most prestigious venues in America in 1955. It was the kind of place that represented the glamour and the excess of the era. It was the kind of place where the richest and most famous people in the world came to be entertained. It had opened just a few years before, in 1952, and it had immediately become the most important entertainment destination in the country. The hotel was a monument to excess, with its marble floors and its crystal chandeliers and its restaurants that served the finest food in the world. The showroom was elegant and sophisticated, designed to make you feel like you were part of something exclusive, something special, something that ordinary people didn't have access to. The waiters wore perfectly pressed tuxedos. The audience was filled with mobsters and celebrities and wealthy businessmen and their wives, the kind of people who had money and power and the confidence that came with knowing that the world was arranged in their favor. It was the kind of place where everything was perfect, where every detail was controlled, where the management worked hard to ensure that their guests felt like they were in the presence of greatness. But beneath the glamour, beneath the polish, beneath the perfection, there was a darkness. There was a system of control that was every bit as rigid and as oppressive as any system in the Jim Crow South. The hotel had very strict policies about who could and could not sit in the showroom. Black people were allowed to perform. The Sands had attracted some of the greatest black entertainers in the world. Sammy Davis Jr. had performed there. Lena Horne had performed there. Many other black entertainers had graced that stage. But black people were not allowed to sit in the main audience. They were not allowed to enjoy the same experience as white guests. There was a separate section in the back, away from the white guests, where black patrons could watch the show if they were allowed to come at all. Even that was often refused. Many black people were not allowed in the hotel at all, except as employees. And if they were allowed to come as patrons, they were confined to a separate area, separated from the white guests by a physical barrier that was designed to make clear the hierarchy that the hotel wanted to maintain. It was a system that was designed to humiliate, to demean, to make clear that black people were not equal, were not welcome, were tolerated only to the extent that they could serve the interests of white people. It was a system that was maintained through the enforcement of written policies and unwritten understandings. It was a system that was supported by the law and by custom and by the willingness of people to accept that this was just the way things were. On this particular night in 1955, a black couple had purchased tickets to see Dean Martin perform. They had heard that he was a great entertainer, that his show was something special, something not to be missed. They had saved up their money. They had dressed carefully in their finest clothes. The woman had bought a new dress, a beautiful dress, in a deep blue color that made her feel beautiful and confident. She had had her hair done at a salon, carefully styled in the fashion of the day. The man had bought a new suit, a dark suit with a white shirt and a tie. The kind of suit that made him feel like a successful man, like a man who deserved to be treated with respect. They had driven to Las Vegas together, excited and hopeful, believing that they were going to have an evening of entertainment and beauty. An evening where they could enjoy themselves without worrying about the divisions that separated people in the world outside. They had purchased tickets for the front row. They had wanted the best seats, the seats with the best view of the stage, the seats where you could see Dean Martin up close, where you could see the expressions on his face, where you could truly appreciate his talent. They had paid for these seats, they had the right to sit in these seats, but when they arrived at the Sands Hotel, when they walked through the doors of the showroom, when they approached their seats, the situation changed. The staff of the hotel began to treat them differently. The attitude of the people around them changed. There was a tension in the air. There were whispered conversations. There were pointed looks. A manager approached them. He was a white man in his 50s, with a smooth manner and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He approached them as if they were friends, as if he was about to do them a favor, but his words made clear what was really happening. "Folks," he said, his voice polite but firm, "I appreciate you coming to our establishment. We're happy to have you here, but I'm going to need to ask you to move to the section in the back. This section is reserved for our white guests. I'm sure you understand. There are very nice seats in the back. You'll have a good view from there. We just maintain these seating areas to ensure that our guests are comfortable. I'm sure you understand." The couple looked at each other. They understood. They understood more than the manager knew. They understood the system. They understood how things worked in America in 1955. They understood that they didn't have power, that the system was against them, that resistance would be futile, that the best they could do was accept this small humiliation with grace and dignity and find their seats in the back where they belonged. They had been through this before. Black people in America in 1955 had learned to absorb these humiliations, to internalize the message that they were less than, to survive by accepting the unacceptable. They understood that the color of their skin meant that they did not have the right to sit in the front row, no matter how much money they had paid for the tickets. The woman felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. The man put his hand on her arm, a gesture that said, "It's okay, we can handle this, we will get through this." They began to gather their things, to prepare to move to the back of the showroom, to accept the humiliation that was being inflicted upon them. But the manager was not satisfied with this quiet acceptance. The manager called over security. He said, "These people need to be moved." The security team arrived, 4 large men in uniforms, men who had been hired to maintain order, to enforce the rules, to ensure that the system of segregation was maintained. The head of security, a man named Robert Collins, approached the couple. He had done this before. He had removed black people from places where they were not wanted before. He understood his job. His job was to make sure that the rules were enforced, that the system was maintained, that the order of things was preserved. But he also understood his power. He understood that he could do this with a modicum of respect or with cruelty. He understood that he could make this humiliation bearable or unbearable. And on this night, for reasons he probably didn't fully understand himself, he chose to use more force than was necessary. He approached the couple, and he put his hand on the man's arm. "Move," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm, it was resolved. It was the voice of a man who expected to be obeyed. The man tried to politely resist. He said, "We paid for these seats. We have tickets." He said it quietly, respectfully, not challenging, just stating a fact. But the security guard didn't care about facts. He didn't care about rights. He cared about maintaining the system. He cared about enforcing the rules. And so he started to forcibly remove the couple from their seats. He grabbed the man's arm and began to pull him away from his seat. The woman tried to help her husband, tried to resist, tried to hold on to him. The security guards were rough. They were not gentle. They were making a point. They were showing the couple, showing the entire audience, showing the system, that black people did not belong in this space, that they would be removed, that their desires and their rights and their humanity would be overridden by force if necessary. The couple was struggling now, not in anger, but in desperation. Trying to maintain their dignity, trying not to be dragged through the showroom like criminals. The scene was playing out right there in front of the audience. People were watching. Some people looked away, unable or unwilling to witness this act of cruelty. Some people watched with interest, with amusement, with the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing the social order being maintained. Some people looked uncomfortable, recognizing that something wrong was happening, but not knowing what to do about it, not wanting to get involved. The entire showroom had become tense. The show had not started yet. Dean Martin was supposed to perform, but before Dean Martin could perform, this scene had to play out. Dean Martin was backstage, in his dressing room, preparing for his performance. His dressing room was luxurious, designed to be comfortable and inspiring. There were flowers on the tables. There were mirrors surrounded by lights. There were comfortable chairs and a full bar. Dean was sitting at his dressing table, adjusting his suit one more time, making sure his hair was perfect, preparing himself mentally for the performance that was about to happen. He had done this thousands of times. It was routine. It was automatic. He didn't think about it anymore. He just did it. The ritual was ingrained in him. Adjust the suit, check the hair, have a drink, run through the first few songs in his head, make sure everything was perfect. Because perfection was what people expected from Dean Martin. Perfection was what he delivered. But then someone burst into his dressing room. It was Frank, one of the stage managers. Frank looked upset. Frank said, "Dean, you need to come out here. There's a situation." Dean looked at Frank in the mirror. He said, "What kind of situation?" Frank said, "Security is removing a couple from the front row. They're black. Management told us they had to move to the back." Dean's expression didn't change. He continued adjusting his suit. Frank continued, "They're being rough about it. They're making a scene. It's getting ugly." Dean could have ignored it. Dean had every reason to ignore it. Dean was about to perform one of the most important shows of his career. The showroom was packed with important people. The show was supposed to be perfect. Creating a scene, getting involved in the conflict, would jeopardize everything. It would jeopardize the show. It would jeopardize his relationship with the management of the Sands Hotel. It would jeopardize his career. There were powerful people at the Sands Hotel. There were mob connections at the Sands Hotel. Getting involved in this situation, taking a stand on this issue, could have serious consequences. Dean could have ignored it. That was what most people would have done. That was what most entertainers did. They pretended not to know what was happening. They pretended not to see. They pretended that the injustice was not happening right in front of them, because acknowledging it would require them to do something about it, would require them to risk something, would require them to stand up and say, "No, this is wrong, and I'm willing to risk everything to make it right." Dean could have gone on stage and done his show and pretended that the world outside of his performance didn't exist. That was what entertainers did. That was what most people did. They separated their public life from their private life. They performed the role that society had assigned to them and ignored the things that made them uncomfortable. But Dean Martin did something different. Dean Martin set down his comb. Dean Martin stood up from his chair. Dean Martin looked at Frank and said, "Take me there." Frank hesitated. He said, "Dean, you don't want to get involved in this. This is management's decision. This is the way things are done here." But Dean was already walking toward the door. Dean was already moving toward the showroom. Dean was already making a decision that would change everything. When Dean walked out into the showroom, everyone stopped what they were doing. The security team stopped their rough handling of the couple. The manager stopped his whispered conversations with other staff members. The audience turned to look. Everyone understood that something important was about to happen. Everyone understood that Dean Martin, who was supposed to be on stage, was instead walking into this situation. Everyone understood that the normal order of things was about to be disrupted. Dean walked directly to where the security team was standing. The couple was still being held by the guards. The woman was crying now, tears streaming down her face. The man was struggling, trying to maintain some sense of dignity while being physically overpowered. Dean looked at the head of security and he said, in a voice that everyone in the showroom could hear, "Stop." He said it with such authority, such absolute certainty, such power, that the security team stopped. They stopped what they were doing and they looked at Dean. The guards released their grip on the couple. The man stumbled forward, regaining his balance. The woman tried to wipe away her tears. "What are you doing?" Dean asked the security team. The head of security, Robert Collins, tried to explain. His voice was respectful, the way you speak to someone who is more powerful than you. He said, "Mr. Martin, these people are in the wrong section. They need to move to the back. Management's orders? They're supposed to be in the back. Dean looked at the head of security, and then he looked at the couple, and then he looked at the entire audience. All the people who were watching this unfold, all the people who were waiting to see what would happen next, and then he said something that would change everything. He said it quietly but clearly so that everyone in the room could hear. He said, "These people paid for these seats. These are their seats. They have the right to sit here, and they are going to sit here. If they leave, I'm leaving too. If you throw them out, I'm done. I'm walking off this stage and I'm never coming back." There was silence, complete silence. The entire showroom had gone quiet. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. Dean Martin, one of the biggest stars in the world, was saying that he would sacrifice his career for two people he had never met. He was saying that he would not perform if these two people were forced to move. He was saying that his conscience was more important than his career. He was saying that what was right was more important than what was safe. The head of security didn't know what to do. He looked at the manager looked at the head of security. Neither of them knew what to do. This was not in the script. This was not something that was supposed to happen. The Sands Hotel was a place where the management had control. The Sands Hotel was a place where the rules were enforced without question, but they had never dealt with a situation like this before. They had never had the main attraction, the star of the show, refused to perform unless the management agreed to something. The manager tried to explain. He said, "Mr. Martin, we have policies, we have a system that works. We have to maintain order, we have to ensure that our guests are comfortable." Dean didn't listen. Dean said, "I don't care about your policies. I don't care about your system. What I care about is what's right. And what's right is that these people get to sit in the front row if they paid for the front row. It's that simple. Either they stay or I go." The manager looked around the showroom, he looked at the audience, he looked at the security team, he looked at the couple that was at the center of this situation. He understood that he had a choice to make. He understood that Dean Martin meant what he said. He understood that Dean Martin was not bluffing. He understood that if he chose to force the couple to move, Dean Martin would walk off the stage and the show would be cancelled. And if the show was cancelled, the Sands Hotel would lose millions of dollars. The boss of the Sands Hotel would not be happy. And the boss of the Sands Hotel was a very powerful man who did not like to be unhappy. The manager made a decision. He said, to the head of security, "Stand down." To the couple, "You can stay. You can sit in the front row. I apologize for this. I sincerely apologize." To Dean Martin, "The show can proceed as planned. You can perform. Thank you for caring so much about these guests." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then the audience began to applaud. But this was different from other nights. This applause was not just for Dean Martin's fame or his talent. This applause was for something else. This applause was an acknowledgement of what had just happened. This applause was a recognition that a man had just done something brave. This applause was a small act of resistance against the way things were. This applause was people beginning to understand that the system they had accepted, the system they had believed was natural and inevitable, the system that had seemed permanent and unchangeable, was actually wrong. This applause was hope. Dean Martin turned to the couple and he smiled at them. He said, "Thank you for coming tonight. I'm honored that you're here. I hope you enjoy the show." Then he walked back to the stage. He disappeared behind the curtain. The audience settled down. The stage crew made final preparations, and then the curtain rose. When Dean Martin stepped out onto that stage, the audience erupted in applause. It was a wall of sound, a roar of approval and excitement. But there was something different about this applause. There was a quality to it that was different from typical applause. There was a sense that something important had just happened, something that had changed the way people understood their world. Dean Martin walked to the microphone and he looked out at the audience. He looked at the couple sitting in the front row. He looked at the people who had witnessed what had just happened, and he began to sing. His voice was perfect, smooth and warm and inviting, exactly what people expected from Dean Martin. But there was something different about the way he sang that night. Every song was a statement. Every song was a challenge to the status quo. He was not just entertaining people, he was trying to change them. He was trying to make them understand that the world they had created was built on a foundation of injustice, and that if they wanted to be better, they had to do better. He sang with passion and fire and purpose. He sang like someone who had just made a decision about what kind of person he wanted to be, and he was committed to living out that decision. He sang standards that people knew and loved, but he sang them differently that night. He sang them with a depth and a complexity that they had never had before. He sang with a pain in his voice, a pain that came from understanding what it meant to be treated as less than, to be discriminated against, to be told that you didn't matter. He sang with a hope in his voice, a hope that things could change, that people could be better, that justice was possible. He sang with a conviction that came from having just taken a stand, from having just chosen what was right over what was safe. The audience was transfixed. People were not just listening to the music, they were listening to something deeper. They were listening to a man trying to communicate something important to them. They were listening to a man trying to change their hearts. And for many people in that audience, he succeeded. For many people in that audience, something shifted in the way they understood the world. For many people in that audience, the fact that one man, one powerful man with everything to lose, had chosen to do what was right, had chosen to stand up against injustice, even though it was difficult, even though it was risky, had shown them what was possible. The show lasted for 2 hours. It was one of the most memorable performances of Dean Martin's career. Every song seemed to have more meaning than it usually did. Every joke seemed to land with more power. Every moment seemed to matter more. And the black couple sitting in the front row watched it all with tears of joy streaming down their faces. They watched Dean Martin sing. They watched him perform for them, perform for everyone, perform with a power and a conviction that came from having just done something brave. And they understood that their lives had been changed by what had happened that night. When the show ended, the audience stood up and applauded. They applauded for a long time. They applauded not just for the show, but for what Dean Martin had done. They applauded for a man who had risked his career for what was right. They applauded for a moment when the wall of segregation had been challenged, when someone had said no, this is wrong, and meant it, and had the power to back it up. Dean Martin took his bows. He looked at the couple in the front row. He nodded at them, a gesture that said, this was for you, this was all for you, and then he walked off the stage. He had done what he believed was right. He had used his power for good. He had stood up against injustice, and the world would never be quite the same. The news of what had happened that night spread quickly. It spread through Las Vegas. It spread through the entertainment industry. It spread through the country. The newspapers picked it up. Some newspapers praised Dean Martin as a hero. Some newspapers condemned him as a race traitor. Some newspapers said he was just trying to get publicity, trying to boost his career by taking a controversial stand. Some newspapers said he was genuinely moved by what he had witnessed, that he had simply done what he believed was right. But whatever people thought about his motivations, they had to acknowledge that he had done something significant. He had used his power and his platform to challenge segregation. He had put his career on the line for two people he had never met. He had shown that one person, in one moment, could make a difference. He had shown that the system was not actually as permanent and immovable as it seemed. He had shown that if you had power and you had conscience, you had a responsibility to use that power to fight for what was right. The story became legendary. It was told and retold. It was used as an example of what could be done when someone with power chose to use that power to fight injustice. It inspired other entertainers to take similar stands. Sammy Davis Jr., who was himself a black entertainer and had faced discrimination in his own career, heard about what Dean Martin had done and was inspired. He began to refuse to perform at segregated venues. He began to insist on equal treatment for all performers. He began to use his own power and platform to fight for civil rights. And he credited Dean Martin with inspiring him to do so. The story inspired other people as well. It showed people that change was possible, that the system was not actually as permanent and unchangeable as it seemed. It showed that one person, in one moment, could make a difference. It showed that if you had power and you had conscience, you had a responsibility to use that power to make the world a better place. But the real power of what happened that night was not in the headlines or the stories that were told afterward. The real power was in the simple fact that a black couple got to sit in the front row and watch a show without being humiliated. The real power was that they were treated with dignity and respect. The real power was that they were able to go home that night and tell their family and friends that they had been welcomed, that they had been treated as equals, that, for one night at least, the system had been challenged and they had won. The real power was in the knowledge that there were people in the world who would stand up and say no. I will not accept this injustice, and I'm willing to risk everything to make it right. The couple that Dean Martin had stood up for would carry the memory of that night with them for the rest of their lives. They would remember the moment when someone with immense power chose to use that power on their behalf. They would remember the feeling of being welcomed, of being treated as equals, of having their dignity respected. They would remember Dean Martin's words. They would remember his conviction. They would remember the way he had stood up for them when they had no power to stand up for themselves. And they would understand that change was possible. They would understand that the system could be challenged. They would understand that there were people in the world who would stand up and say, "No, this is wrong, and I'm willing to risk everything to make it right." They would tell their children about that night. They would tell them about Dean Martin. They would say, "There was a man named Dean Martin who risked everything for us. There was a man who believed that we deserved to be treated with respect. There was a man who understood that what was happening was wrong and who had the courage to say so, even though it cost him." They would tell their grandchildren about it. They would keep the memory alive, and the story would live on in their family, passed down from generation to generation, a reminder that change was possible, that justice was worth fighting for, that one person could make a difference. In the years that followed, the entertainment industry began to change, slowly at first, but then more rapidly. Other entertainers began to refuse to perform at segregated venues. Other venues began to integrate their showrooms. The walls that had seemed so permanent and unmovable began to crack. The system that had seemed so inevitable began to show its weakness. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. Laws were being passed, change was happening, and while there were many people who contributed to this change, many activists and civil rights leaders and ordinary people who stood up and said, "Enough," the moment at the Sands Hotel remained important. It remained significant. It remained a symbol of what one person could do. Dean Martin never made a big deal about what he had done. He never sought credit for it. He never used it to boost his career or to make himself look good. When people thanked him for what he had done, when people praised him for his courage, he would wave it away and say, "It was nothing. It was the right thing to do. Anyone would have done the same." But people knew better. People understood that most people wouldn't have done the same. Most people wouldn't have risked their careers and their livelihoods and their reputations to take a stand. Most people would have looked away. Most people would have pretended not to see. Most people would have protected themselves and let the injustice continue. But Dean Martin was not most people. Dean Martin was a man who had come from poverty and had understood what it meant to be on the outside. He was a man who had been mocked and discriminated against because of his accent and his heritage. He was a man who had clawed his way up from nothing and had not forgotten what it felt like to be powerless. He was a man who understood what it meant to be treated as less than, to be told that you didn't matter, to be denied opportunities because of who you were. And so, when he saw someone else being treated unfairly, when he saw someone else being discriminated against, when he saw the system inflicting its cruelty on two people who were just trying to enjoy an evening of entertainment, he had the empathy to understand what they were going through. He had the courage to stand up, he had the power to make a difference, and he chose to use it. The night security tried to expel a black couple from Dean Martin's show at the Sands Hotel became the most defining moment of his life and legacy. More than his music, films, or fame, that act of defiance transformed him from an entertainer into a man of conscience who chose to use his power to confront injustice. Though Dean Martin went on to achieve legendary success, those who knew him understood that he was forever shaped by that night, carrying the memory of standing up for what was right. That single moment resonated far beyond the showroom. It mattered to the couple he defended, to everyone who witnessed it, and to a nation struggling with segregation. It proved that the system could be challenged and that one person, in one moment, could make a difference. Over time, the story became part of American cultural history, symbolizing the idea that true strength lies not in fame or fear, but in courage, responsibility, and the willingness to stand against injustice.